activity at all in which the monks did not display creativity and a fertile spirit of research. Utilizing their labor force, they instructed and trained it to perfection. Monastic know-how would spread throughout Europe. In fact, even today, we're still only beginning to appreciate fully the extent of monastic technological cleverness. In the late 1990s, an archaeometallurgist at the University of Bradford named Jerry MacDonald found evidence in North Yorkshire, England, of a degree of technological sophistication that pointed ahead to the great machines of the 18th century Industrial Revolution. He found that the monks had built a furnace to extract iron from ore. Now, in the 16th century, which is when the period that MacDonald was looking at, 16th century England, the typical one of these furnaces in the 16th century had not advanced very far over its ancient counterpart. It was very inefficient. The slag, or it's another word for the byproduct of these primitive furnaces, had a very substantial concentration of iron in it, because they couldn't get to high enough temperatures to get all the iron out of the ore. So the leftover still had a lot of iron in it. But MacDonald found that when he was investigating, that in fact the monks in England had in fact built a furnace where the slag was low in iron content. They were somehow able to get to high enough temperatures to get more and more of the iron out of it, very similar to a modern blast furnace today. So MacDonald says the monks were on the verge of building dedicated furnaces for the large-scale production of cast iron. This is the key ingredient, perhaps, that ushered in the industrial age, and he says that the furnace that he investigated in England was a prototype of such a furnace. Now, what ended up happening to that? Why didn't they develop all these big furnaces? Why do we just see this one prototype? Well, remember, this is the 16th century in England. What's King Henry VIII up to? Well, he's closing down monasteries and confiscating their property so as to reward his well-connected friends. And so, Henry VIII helped to destroy this outstanding example of creativity on the part of the monks. Thank you very much, Henry VIII. We'll have time to talk about you in a future episode. But we also now have charitable work. Now, charitable work we're going to spend a whole episode on, but I want to at least pause and say something about the monks' specific contributions to charity. The rule of St. Benedict called for the monastery to dispense alms and hospitality to whatever extent its means permitted. Specifically, it instructed monasteries that all guests who come shall be received as though they were Christ. Now, the monasteries served as free inns where foreign travelers and pilgrims and the poor could find a safe resting place. I love this quotation from an old historian of the Norman Abbey of Bec. He said, "Let them ask Spaniards or Burgundians or any foreigners whatever how they have been received at Bec. They will answer that the door of the monastery is always open to all and that its bread is free to the whole world." In some cases, the monks were even known to make efforts to track down poor souls who, being lost or alone after dark, found themselves in need of emergency shelter. They established contrivances for warning sailors of perilous obstacles. Or, in fact, nearby monasteries often made provision for shipwrecked men in need of lodging. All these were typical contributions of the monks. They also built up the medieval infrastructure and built and repaired roads and bridges. But as part of their charitable work, they were also great physicians for their day. In fact, it was the church that helped to create the hospital in the first place. But the monks went even further, because there weren't hospitals everywhere. But there were a lot of monasteries. And initially, the monks provided medical care to their fellow monks. But as time went on, they realized that they possessed a critical skill that local townspeople also needed. So oftentimes they would go out into the local towns and seek out sick people who were in need of their medical care. Again, I would say that's a fairly unsung aspect of the monastic contribution. But in addition to being great physicians and agriculturists and inventors, they were also great educators. St. John Chrysostom tells us that it was already in his day, around the 4th century, it was already customary for people in Antioch to send their sons to be educated by the monks. St. Boniface established a school in every monastery he founded in Germany. In England, St. Augustine, and here we're talking not about St. Augustine of Hippo, but St. Augustine of Canterbury. St. Augustine and his monks set up schools wherever they went. St. Patrick is given credit for encouraging Irish scholarship. And of course, the Irish monasteries developed into very important centers of learning, and they dispensed instruction to monks and laymen alike. Now, sometimes it's been said that the monks did engage in some education, but they were really only educating their fellow monks. Well, that's, as we've seen, not entirely true. There are plenty of cases we have on record of the monks providing education to people in the local area. But let us say that that accusation is true. Let's even grant it for the sake of argument. Let's say that the monastery's contribution had simply been to teach other monks how to read and write. That's all it was. Well, even if that had been their only contribution, that would have been no small accomplishment. Because consider what happened in the Greek Dark Ages. Now, people have typically forgotten about this, but it's very important. From about 1100 to 800 BC, we had something called the Greek Dark Ages. And what happened here was that the Mycenaean Greeks had some kind of terrible disaster befall them. The nature of that disaster is still debated. But something terrible happened to these people. And when the smoke had cleared, for the next 300 years, we find that, in effect, the ancient Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks, had lost literacy. They had lost the ability to read and write. Now you wonder, how could you lose the ability to read and write? How could you forget that? Well, partly it happened because people were scattered following whatever disaster it was that befell them. And they had to think solely of their own survival. And learning how to read and write was not exactly critical when you just needed food and sustenance. Secondly, it's been speculated that maybe whatever disaster struck the Mycenaean Greeks struck in particular the educated classes, so that those who would have remembered literacy were in fact wiped out. Well, whatever the explanation, the fact is they lost literacy at a time of general civilizational collapse. Well, let's remember that the monks were functioning and carrying out all these wonderful tasks I've described at a time in Western European history that was very similar. There was general collapse. There was political disorder. There was an abandonment of education by and large. There was an abandonment of urban life. That was the environment in which the monks functioned. And so, even if all they had done was to keep literacy alive, well, that's very important, because that means they prevented a repeat of the Greek Dark Ages, when literacy was lost. Thanks to the monasteries, literacy was not lost, but Western Europe managed to hang on to it. That's no small contribution, is it? In fact, the contributions of the monks have been so great that even scholars who are inclined to be unsympathetic to them have conceded it. And I've always tried to go out of my way, when I've written about Catholic history, to cite not only non-Catholics, but anti-Catholics when possible, so that people won't come back and say that I'm just picking and choosing among my sources. When people who don't even like the Catholic Church are saying, okay, the monks did a lot, that says something. So, for example, one unsympathetic scholar said, the monks not only established the schools, and were the schoolmasters in them, but also laid the foundations for the universities. They were the thinkers and philosophers of the day, and shaped the political and religious thought. To them, both collectively and individually, was due the continuity of thought and civilization of the ancient world with the later Middle Ages and with the modern period. That's no small compliment. A century ago, another historian said, it was the monks, and they alone, who carried to a successful issue the tremendous undertaking of mollifying the rampant invader, softening the rudeness of his manners and the harshness of his spirit, familiarizing him with the restraints of Christian morality, and bringing home to him with convincing power the necessity of observing the fundamental principles of law and order, instructing him in the use of arts and instruments of industry and social progress, in a word, of assimilating, civilizing, and Christianizing 20-odd barbarian tribes, many of which, by the way, were very impressed with the morality and the conviction of the monks. They were very moved by their witness. A Protestant historian says, "Had it not been for the monks and monasteries, the barbarian deluge might have swept away utterly the traces of Roman civilization." The monk was the pioneer of civilization and Christianity in England, Germany, Poland, Bohemia, Sweden, Denmark. With the incessant din of arms around him, it was the monk in his cloister, for instance on Mount Athos, who by preserving and transcribing ancient manuscripts, both Christian and pagan, as well as by recording his observations of contemporaneous events, was handing down the torch of knowledge unquenched to future generations and hoarding up stores of erudition for the researches of a more enlightened age. The first musicians, painters, farmers, statesmen in Europe after the downfall of imperial Rome, under the onslaught of the barbarians, were monks. Now these are critics of the monks. You can only imagine what their friends have to say. These are their critics. Here is the monastic contribution. And you'll notice that in this brief overview, I've not even mentioned, or at least hardly so, the contributions they made to the literature of the Western world by preserving ancient classics and indeed the Bible itself through laborious copying. Because that is the one thing that's conceded to us. The monks did this. But what I wanted to show you is they did so much else in so many areas, one can hardly even believe it. Now today we touched briefly on the subject of charity, because we saw the monks as great dispensers of charity. Guests are to be treated as if they were Christ himself. Well, that is a small part of the story of Catholic charity, which will occupy us next time. Catholic charity is one of these areas in which people will concede the Catholic Church has done wonderful things. But what I want to suggest to you is that even we Catholics don't realize just how great Catholic charity is. It's a far more extraordinary story than even we believe. So join me next time on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. See you then.